Hello and welcome. My name is Matthew Stefanski, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Polish American Arts Association of Washington, D.C. And I am pleased to host this virtual event today by acclaimed author Annik LaFarge. She is the author of Chasing Chopin, a music journey across 3 centuries, 4 countries, and a half dozen revolutions. But first, I would like to introduce the PAAA President, Cecilia Larkin. Celia?
Okay, so thank you, Matthew, and welcome everyone to our virtual presentation, a program inspired by the music of Chopin. Before I begin, I would like to introduce our team. First of all, Matthew Stefanski, whom you just met, chairman of the event and overall coordinator of the program, Renata Greenspan, in charge of the Zoom setup, and Ted Miretsky, registration and fundraising coordinator. I would like to recognize some special guests who are joining us today. Harris Miller, chairman of the board of the National Philharmonic Orchestra. Kinga Augustin, joining us from New York, welcome. She's the rising star of the violin. She performed at the PAA virtual concert last summer, and her most recent recordings are sponsored in part by the PAAA and ACPC. It's so nice to see you here. Raymond Glembocki, president of the American Council for Polish Culture. Jarosław Gołębiowski, composer and vice president of the ACPC. Marie Hejnosz from Philadelphia, president of the Polish Heritage Society of Philadelphia. We also have from the Polish Embassy, Dagmara Jasińska, cultural counselor of the embassy, and a former head of culture and science section at the Polish Embassy, Sławomir Zagórski. Thank you for being with us. And again, our very own Ted Miretsky, who is also on the board of directors of the National Philharmonic and is its chairman of the artistic committee. Ted is the PAA music chairman, and in any of the previous years, at this time, he would be arranging a concert to be held at a live venue such as Polish Embassy or the Arts Club of Washington that would feature music of Chopin and other composers. These concerts benefit the PAA Polish Scholarship Program. Due to the pandemic, a live concert is not possible this year, so we are doing something different, and we hope you will find equally as exciting. Although we didn't sell tickets to this event, many of our members and friends made donations to the scholarship fund, and we have raised close to $6,000. Thank you to all for your generosity, which will allow us to continue supporting talented students of Polish descent with grants for their education, as well as we have been doing for the past 20 years. And now it's time to begin our program. I wish to extend a very warm welcome and thank author Annik LaFarge for first giving us the account of her adventure with the music of Frédéric Chopin in her exciting book, and for agreeing to share it with us here. But before we start the presentation, let's listen to the reading of the end papers of the book, printed with the score of the music of Frédéric Chopin that inspired this book. The Funeral March from Sonata No. 2, Opus 35, is performed for us by pianist Alvin Smithson.
Thank you, Alvin, for that wonderful performance and for really putting us in the spirit of Chopin for this event. So thank you so much. And at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today's event, Annik LaFarge. Ms. LaFarge is a writer, editor, photographer, lecturer, and a native New Yorker. She has spent 25 years in the book industry, beginning as a publicist and going on to become vice president and associate publisher at two Random House imprints, Time Books and Villard, and later Simon & Schuster. In 2020, she published On the High Line, exploring America's most original urban park, which won the IPPY Award for Travel Guide. Most recently, she is author of Chasing Chopin, the book you will be seeing a lot today, which is a musical journey across 3 centuries, 4 countries, and a half dozen revolutions, published by Simon & Schuster in 2020. The work focuses on the composition story of Frédéric Chopin's Second Piano Sonata as a way of exploring his life, work, and enduring legacy in popular and art culture. Annik, thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time out of your schedule. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and please let me give you the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you, Alvin, for that really wonderful performance. I've done a lot of talks about my new book over the past 6 months, and I've always wanted to play the entire third movement of Chopin's Funeral Sonata beforehand, but this is the first time that it's happened. So I'm really happy that you all have the music in your ear now. And I'm going to share my screen. Did that work, Matthew? Is that okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, good. So I've been doing bookstore events and lectures for this book that I've written, Chasing Chopin, for many months now. And there's one question that always seems to come up, and that is, how do you go from the High Line, a 21st century park created from an abandoned elevated railroad in New York City, to a piano sonata by a romantic composer that was written in Europe in the 19th century? And the answer turns out to be quite simple. It was actually the most natural thing in the world. And I think the main clue for why that is lies in that one word, romantic. Because in fact, I think the High Line was a quintessentially romantic idea. And what originally knocked my socks off when I took my first walk through the park after it opened in 2009 is really the same thing that knocked me out when I first heard Chopin's sonata. Each of them, one through architecture and horticulture, and the other through music, takes us out of our familiar world by presenting a series of unexpected contrasts and juxtapositions that has a surprisingly powerful and lasting emotional effect. And I'm going to begin today by briefly explaining what I found so striking about Chopin's B-flat minor sonata, his Opus 35, so you can understand what I'm talking about in musical terms. And then I'm going to switch over to the High Line and try to show you what it was about this place that resonated so powerfully for me, and how I discovered this very vibrant and kindred romantic spirit in both the music and the landscape. And Opus 35 was Chopin's second piano sonata, and the story of its composition, which took place over a period of 3 years ending in 1839, is the main narrative of my new book. The first time I heard this sonata was at the Polish consulate on Madison Avenue in New York, and the pianist was Michael Kimmelman, the wonderful architecture critic for the New York Times, whose work I'm sure many of you know. What you may not know is that he also happens to be a world-class pianist, and even considered pursuing that as a career before he turned to journalism. Now, even people who insist they know nothing about Chopin's music or classical music in general all know the iconic dirge in this sonata, because all of us, in fact, grew up with it. Members of my generation got their first hearing of it in the old Looney Tunes cartoon, when it was regularly used to signal that something very tragic was about to happen, like the imminent execution of Sylvester the cat. Members of my parents' generation remember the melody more poignantly as the soundtrack of JFK's funeral cortege, making its very sad journey through the streets of Washington, and followed by that unforgettable riderless horse. I'm sorry about the quality of that clip, but it's literally the only one I could find of it on the internet. And the work is still played in important state funerals, most recently in Rome just last month, where a military band performed it for the funeral of the Italian ambassador to Congo after his assassination. And I'm going to post a link in the chat section after this, after I've done speaking, for anyone who would like to watch this broadcast. I found it extremely moving, and the music and the pomp around it really capture the sense of timeless tragedy that Chopin infused into this music. But what astonished me when I heard Michael Kimmelman play the whole sonata is that the third movement actually consists of three contrasting parts. After the famous dirge, Chopin asks for a tiny breath by the performer. He modulates from a minor key to a major key, and now he presents something starkly different, an absolutely beautiful nocturne-like song that completely undercuts the mood of sorrow and loss that precede it. And I'm going to play just 30 seconds of this middle section just to remind you of that extraordinary musical collision of worlds that happens in this movement as it travels from minor to major. And as you can see, I've circled the transition, which is a lovely A-flat octave that belongs not to B-flat minor, which is the main tonality of the sonata. It's the place that we've just been, but to its harmonic relative or complement, D-flat major, the place that we're going to, which is where the clip begins. And I did this because even if you don't read music, you'll be able to see just from looking at the pattern of the notes on the 2 pages that something very different begins to happen after those A-flats. To me, this middle section conveys a message from the departed. It says, I haven't left, I'm here with you still, remember me in joy. Chopin has interrupted the steady, tragic walking pace of his funeral march and now invites you to stop and look around you. It's like a little gift, a force of love and life that was injected into the middle of a death march. And then when this lovely section is finished, the pianist takes another tiny breath, turns the page, and the dirge returns, now in its original and inexorable key of B-flat minor. So we haven't been able to avoid death, but it has been threaded through with something else, and something very beautiful and comforting. So in the course of this one movement, Chopin embraces the whole circle of life. It's not just about the tragedy of death. It's a kind of narrative arc that uses the tools and conventions of Western music making, so modulating between major and minor keys, to bend that arc from death and sadness through optimism and love. And I was astonished when I heard it, not only because it was so surprising to learn that Chopin was telling such a different and more nuanced story in his funeral march than popular culture has allowed, because of course you never hear that middle section outside of the concert hall. But it also astonished me because it seems so real, so authentic. This idea that the experience of death and loss should be modulated, tempered, softened even by the experience of love and joy, and that one doesn't and really can't exist without the other. And the fact of those two opposing emotions coming into play in a work of art is a quintessentially romantic idea. And this is one of the first things I discovered when I started researching my book and reading about the popular artists in Chopin's orbit, the painter Eugène Delacroix, the Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz, composers Giacomo Meyerbeer and Hector Berlioz, the novelist Georges Sand, who was Chopin's lover for almost 9 years, and Victor Hugo, to name just a few. I learned that a signature quality of the Romantic artist was a preoccupation with the concept of duality, the notion that we contain multitudes, that we're not each of us one single thing, but really an ongoing skirmish between different forces that battle within us, good and evil, male and female, strength and weakness, hope and despair, hatred and love, a faith in God and a faith in science. And all of these subjects played out in the work of these different artists during the period that I write about in the 1830s and 1840s, when Chopin was working on his sonata. And perhaps the most famous work, which influenced virtually every artist of the period all over Europe, was Goethe's Dr. Faustus, which put the tension between the forces of good and evil into play in the person of one scientist who turns to magic and sells his soul to the devil. And these are just a few lithographs by Delacroix that he made for a deluxe edition of Goethe's book in the 1820s, which I saw at that big, wonderful show the Delacroix show at the Met a few years ago. Another defining characteristic of the Romantics was a deep, almost existential connection to place and the mysteries and stories that it contains. And when you think about artists like William Wordsworth, Emily Bronte, Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, John Constable, William Blake, a visual landscape almost always comes simultaneously to mind because their work is so tied to place, whether it's the Lake Country or the Yorkshire moors in England, the Alps in Switzerland, Walden Pond or the streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn in America, Heaven and Hell in the work of William Blake. Place and landscape is an essential preoccupation, and often it's the emotional and psychological animus in a work of Romantic poetry, painting, or literature. And Georges Sand, Chopin's lover, gorgeously articulated these twin preoccupations of the Romantic artist in her book, Winter in Majorca, where she and Chopin spent a harrowing but artistically very rich several months in the winter of 1838 and 39. She described Majorca as a landscape of severity and grace, melancholy and magnificence. And it was this observation that prompted me to make Majorca the first step on my research travels. And I saw for myself exactly what she meant. This is a drawing by the French painter Jean Bonaventure Laurens of Georges Sand meditating in the cemetery just outside the walls of the abandoned monastery where she, Chopin, and her two children lived for several months. And this is what it looks like today. I went to a bistro there every night to drink beer and eat pizza and caught a photo of this fellow one night as he was sitting meditating in that same place that Georges Sand loved so much. And these are just a few photos I took while I was there that capture the mingled quality of this beautiful place, its severity and grace, melancholy and magnificence. The poet Robert Graves was also in love with Majorca and was obsessed with the moonlight there. I took this one from my hotel patio early one morning while listening to the sound of sheep bells in the distance. And this last one was taken from a monastery that Sand and Chopin visited together, and where she found herself at an uncharacteristic loss of words when she looked out on the preposterous blue of the Balearic Sea. But I'm going to yank us away from this wild, natural European beauty and move us to an entirely different landscape now, one with its own set of contradictions and complexities. And the High Line, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, was originally an elevated freight rail line that opened in 1934 and ran from Spring Street in the West Village to 34th Street, where it then returned to grade and continued north along the Hudson River to Albany. This is one of the most iconic photographs of the park, taken in 2011 by Ewan Bond, a photographer who very graciously has allowed me to use it in lectures. And it shows this improbable strip of green running 30 feet above street level, cutting through and behind former industrial buildings, parking lots, factories, warehouses. The High Line was built as part of Robert Moses's West Side Improvement Project to correct an extremely dangerous situation that had been playing out in the streets of the far West Side for decades, ever since freight trains had been permitted to run at grade along the avenues. So many people were killed in the streets, including a great many children, that 10th Avenue came to be known as Death Avenue. And the fellow that you see on horseback in these photos was known as the West Side Cowboy. And his job, which was created in the 1850s in response to the death toll, was to escort every train and alert people that it was coming. And the horseman was required to wave a red flag by day and a red lantern by night. And elevating the tracks in the 1930s completely removed the danger from the streets, and it changed everything, creating a seamless highway for trains high above the vehicular and pedestrian traffic. And the railroad was just 100 yards or so from the Hudson River, which meant that it could easily connect with goods that had been delivered to the port of New York along our country's original transportation superhighway, the Hudson River. So to show you the proximity of the river to the railroad, this is a photo I took on the High Line of the Queen Elizabeth as it sailed past one of the abandoned piers. And here's an aerial shot that shows the remains of the old piers up in the upper right-hand corner. Today they're known as pile fields, and they dot the shoreline of the river. And that large building was once a refrigerated warehouse. Today it's a condominium. And at the bottom left, you can see the large rectangular space that once was a tunnel through the building that the trains would pass through. And today this spot is the southernmost end of the High Line. And I can't resist showing you this wonderful, more recent photograph that the Whitney Museum shared with me, which shows the completed museum, which opened in 2015 in the same spot at the southern end of the High Line. The High Line was such a vital artery for the delivery of meat and dairy and produce from all around the country that it became known as the lifeline of New York. This is the Nabisco factory, originally known as Unita Bakers, which connected to the viaduct at 14th Street. and over many decades moved countless packages of Malamars, Fig Newtons, and animal crackers. I'm sure many of your kids ate them. They all reached their final destination in your home after a run up the High Line. And this is another of the refrigerated warehouses that was built to accommodate the new line. This is what it looks like today, where it's the headquarters of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And one of the great innovations of the High Line was its system of spurs. So a train could just veer off the main track and enter a warehouse, as you see here, or it could sidle up to a loading dock and then pull away and continue on its route, as you see here. This is a rooftop view of one of the spurs that connects the main line with a refrigerated warehouse. And today it's one of the many gardens in the High Line Park. By the 1960s, the era of interstate trucking, global air travel, and containerized shipping overtook the railroads, and the High Line ceased operation. Parts of the lower section were torn down in the 1960s and 1970s, and the last train ran in 1980. The viaduct, now abandoned, went to seed, and plants of every imaginable kind began to grow up in what had become a wild garden filled with evergreen, maple, and oak trees, dandelions, Virginia creeper, black cherry, bearded iris, and acres of Queen Anne's lace. This is one of my favorite photographs, taken just at the northern end of the park. This photo, which I showed you a few moments ago, shows a grocer's warehouse and a train at the loading dock. This is what it looked like in the 1990s when it was filled with ailanthus trees, which were originally imported to America from China in the 1780s. And a scientific study was conducted in 2003, and it was discovered that more than 160 plant species were thriving in the abandoned viaduct, both natives of North America who arrived here like little plant hobos on boxcars that came from all over the country on the Transcontinental Railroad, but also exotics from Europe and even as far away as Africa, whose seeds were carried here in the droppings of migrating birds who crossed an ocean or two to get to Manhattan. In 1999, two young men, Robert Hammond and Joshua David, launched a plan to save the viaduct and turn it into a great public space. And the modern park, after a long, grueling battle, is the result. It opened in June of 2009, and today extends from Gansevoort Street to 34th Street. So that's just a tiny thumbnail history. And now I'm going to return to my original theme and why the High Line is such a quintessentially romantic place. And in fact, the first time I visited the park on the day that it opened to the public, I was struck by that same feast of juxtapositions that I had found so compelling and surprising in Chopin's sonata, the astonishing contradiction of walking on this solid steel viaduct, yet feeling at the same time that I was kind of floating in air 30 feet above the streets of Manhattan, that I was both part of the city and outside it at the same time. And throughout the park, you have this mixture of hard and soft surfaces and the presence all around you of this rusting industrial ruin. There are smokestacks, abandoned piers, old meat hooks where entire sides of cattle would hang after a train from the Midwest deposited them from a meat packing plant at street level, dilapidated buildings, and then all these rusting tracks throughout with familiar names like Baltimore and Ohio or Lackawanna engraved on the sides. And all of this interspersed with sleek, ultra-modern architecture. It's the inherent contradictions that really animate this place and create so many openings, so many unexpected views in an urban landscape that we all think we know quite well. And suddenly we see it anew from an entirely different perspective. The setting is filled with contrasts and juxtapositions, discordant encounters that kind of tweak your emotions and remind you that the past is always present in our landscape. And it's that collision of worlds that so delighted the 19th century romantics. And another obsession of the romantic artists was a veneration for ruins, particularly those of ancient Greece and Rome. They painted them, wrote poems about them, even installed imitations in their own gardens. And this is just one famous example made by Thomas Cole, father of the Hudson River School in America, and painted a year or so before Chopin began working on his sonata. And we see this preoccupation with history in the High Line too, and it's best illustrated with a comparison to its sister park, the Promenade Plantée in the 12th arrondissement of Paris, which is another elevated rail line that was turned into a park. This one opened in 1993 and was an inspiration to Robert Hammond and Joshua David when they started thinking about the High Line. But there's a crucial difference in the philosophies of the two places. In Paris, the horticulture plan called for a highly formal, ornamental, classical French garden whose lush plantings erased every trace of the railroad that once ran here. It's very beautiful, but you would never know what this viaduct originally was unless you had been told. And the designers of the High Line, by contrast, wanted to expose the history. In the architecture and the design of this place, they wanted to tell the story to everyone who came here about this innovative, unusual railroad and what it meant in the history of transportation in New York City. So they restored and repainted all the Art Deco railings of the Robert Moses era. They embedded the original railroad tracks in the walkways and the garden beds. They called attention to the old signal lights and meat hooks and other vestiges of the railroad. And they venerated both the place and the story and everything that they did. And if the creation of the High Line is an essentially romantic idea, it's in large part because the people who inspired its vision were in their own way neo-romantics. And this especially applies to the horticulture, where I think the romantic spirit can be most enduringly found. The genius of this place exhibits itself most prominently in the park's original concept of creating a series of gardens, like galleries in an art museum, that would enhance a visitor's sense of discovery as she meanders through this dramatic and constantly changing environment, one that's influenced as much by uncontrollable factors like weather and season as it is by the hand of its creators. So there's a little forest of birch trees, there's a meadow, there's a woodland thicket, there's a bog, and there's even a lawn. Not keeping up with my slides. The emotional palette of this place is always on the move. And what struck me as time went by was that underneath it all is this very playful, romantic idea of a place that contains multitudes. You can't pin it down at any point and say, this is what this place is, because the next time you come, the scene is quite different. So the person I want to just briefly focus on is Pete Outolf, whom I've come to think of as the poet of landscape, just as Chopin was known as the poet of the piano. Pete is an artist who follows the command of that great romantic novelist, Victor Hugo, to do as nature does, which is to proceed by contrasts. In Pete's garden, it's the whole cycle of a plant's life that delights us, from the bright colors of the blooming season to the dry, spiky, seed-encrusted stalks of winter. Pete Outolf once told a reporter that dying in an interesting way is as important as living. And so his gardens are designed to engage all our senses through sound, motion, color, scent, and texture, throughout the cycle of the year, from birth through decline and eventually death. And if you visit the High Line in every season of the year, you experience this fundamentally romantic vision in the landscape, the surprising beauty that emerges from the dying plants, which always holds out the promise of a new kind of beauty, those bursting colors and willowy stems that start proliferating in the springtime. And that's why the park is so stunning, even in the dead of winter. Unlike most gardens around the world, the plants are not cut back in autumn. Instead, they're left alone throughout the winter months. And slowly over time, the perennials and grasses and trees and shrubs go dormant. They lose their foliage. They change color. Stalks bend or break. The seed pods harden. The winter landscape of the High Line is starkly beautiful and presents its own distinctive array of unexpected and incredibly diverse shapes and colors and textures. And I can't emphasize enough how surprising the High Line in winter is for people who love formal gardens, which are almost always trimmed and pruned at the onset of cold weather. The High Line offers something very different, an unusual show of plants that are in the process of transitioning from one stage of life to another. Unlike most great formal gardens, the gardeners here don't hide this process from public view or deny visitors the chance to experience it. Instead, they allow it to play out naturally, encouraging us to see and appreciate the entire life cycle of this great diversity of plants that was inspired by the original wild garden that grew up here after the train stopped running. And of course, this is partly what made the place itself such an innovation in the field of public parks and gardens. Its zeitgeist goes against the traditional orthodoxy of the great formal gardens of the world. Every spring, in fact, exactly this time of year, there's a massive volunteer project called the Cutback, which brings people from all over New York City, people of every age and background, to participate in the clipping and pruning that clears away all the dead material for the new growing season. And this event, which lasts for a few weeks every March, becomes another part of the story that's told on the High Line each year, one that points to its history, its present, and even its future. So for me, walking the High Line for the first time created a similar experience to the one I had as a classical music lover when I heard Chopin's Funeral Sonata played through for the first time. My research later helped me understand how in the canon of funeral marches, which dates back to the 17th century, this movement of Chopin's sonata was a pure innovation, and that by mingling the minor key dirge with the major key song, he was doing something that no one had ever done before. He was presenting something that would have been both very familiar to his audience, but was also wondrously new. The surprise of both the High Line and this music, for me at least, is the joy and the sense of discovery that comes from these startling contrasts, from seeing and then seeing again, or hearing and then hearing again. And this, in the end, is the thing that connects them for me and makes them very, very precious and wonderful works of art. So I thank you. And I have this one last slide just to thank my friends at the great independent bookstore that you all know in Washington, Politics and Prose, which was very happy to hear that I was doing this talk in support of your scholarship. And so they've offered a 10% discount for anybody who would like to buy the book. And I'll be happy to send a book plate. In the pandemic era, Simon & Schuster created these lovely little things that stick inside the book. So you can email me at the address on the screen, or Matthew knows how to reach me as well. So I'm going to unshare my screen now. And I'll be delighted to take any questions or hear any observations, which always interest me, what you all are thinking and playing and listening to.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that brief but intense presentation, and kind of reminding us that the arts are not just music and painting, but can also be understood to be landscape and urban design and gardening. So I think it's a really interesting perspective, and helps us continually to reimagine what it means when we're talking about romanticism or the arts broadly. So thank you for that. Just to kick off our conversation, and to hopefully everyone is thinking of questions they want to ask of you. But I wanted to ask, you started off by mentioning that your journey with Chopin began at the Polish consulate in New York. And presumably all of us have at one point in our lives heard a song that touched us, but few of us go on to then write a book based off that one experience. So could you just kind of tell us what was it like going from sitting in that beautiful building to later deciding to write a book, to actually traveling? Walk us through that. How did you arrive at that point, and what did that process look like for you? What did that journey look like?
Well, it was actually quite a lot longer. I heard Kimmelman's concert in the middle of the 1990s, I think. And I got the sheet music and I started playing. I can't play the whole sonata. It's very hard. Pretty much all of Chopin's music is very hard, but I can play the entire third music. And I did every day for a long time. And then I found that it kept turning up in different ways. For instance, I went to see my mother for the last time. She was in Mass General, the hospital in Boston. And I knew it was the last time I was going to see her before she died. And I got on the train to go back to New York, and the music from Chopin's Funeral March came into my brain on the Amtrak, but it wasn't the dirge. It was the trio, which is what scholars call that middle section, that lovely song. And I thought, God, how does that happen? That's weird. And so I took the sheet music out and put it on the music stand. And the next morning I started playing it, and I played it every day until she died. And then another 6 or 8 months later, a very dear friend of mine, an author I had worked with, was dying in Chicago and asked me to fly out to see her. So I did. And on the way home, I stopped by a jazz club before getting the train back to New York. I love trains, as you can probably tell. And I'm sitting there in this jazz club, and suddenly these guys veer off from this very vibrant, classic jazz standard into a riff on Chopin's Funeral March. And it was so stuff like that just kept happening and happening. So I started Googling on the train home, and I found that the work had really been appropriated by a lot of different artists. And I learned how innovative it really had been when he wrote it, but how it was many, many decades until it was really understood how innovative it was, and how it became a work of almost a cliche in pop culture almost immediately after he published it. So I just got more and more interested, and the more I researched, the more I found myself being drawn to the story and the different themes that were present, and the different people in his orbit who are quite fascinating.
Excellent, thank you. And speaking of that cliche in the sonata, you write in the book that Chopin is really presents a juxtaposition of both tragedy and hope. But it seems like this song has become almost entirely identifiable with tragedy. Do you think that was his intention? Was this kind of co-opted by events around him, or how do you think it should be interpreted today?
Well, one of the really interesting things that I discovered pretty early on in my research is that Chopin, before he sent one of the last versions of the manuscript to his publisher, actually ran his pen through the word funèbre in French, funeral, leaving it as just Marche, which left one of the scholar, Jeffrey Kalberg, who's written about this more than any other scholar, left him wondering, was the world's most famous funeral march really a funeral march after all? And I speculate in the book as to why he did that. And I think there are some good reasons for that. But he didn't at the very, very end intend it to be a funeral march. And if you look, and it was wonderful, by the way, that Alvin, any author would be over the moon that an artist actually used the end papers of her book as a score. That really blew my mind. I thank you so much for that. You could have used the score and you didn't. But it's you see in the end papers of the book, it says just Marche, because it's the urtext. It's not the version that most of us buy at our local music store, which often still says marche funèbre, funeral march. So it's been misinterpreted, this work, really ever since it was published, and that to me was part of the interesting, compelling part of the story.
Absolutely. And one final question on my end, and I hope afterwards we can have some questions from the audience. So if you have any, please feel free to let me know. But when we were listening earlier to Alvin perform, as you mentioned, he sounded wonderful. But reading your work kind of made me realize that the music of Chopin that we hear today is not the same music that Chopin wrote or performed on his own, right? Could you speak a little bit about that change in music due to the change in instruments from his time to today? I'm sure that'll be really interesting for our audience to hear.
Well, one of the most interesting and important visits that I made during my research was to a place in a little town, tiny town called Ashburnham, Massachusetts, which is about an hour outside of Boston, called the Frederick Collection of Historic Pianos. And they have about 30 different pianos ranging from the 1920s all the way down to the 1790s. And what they do in this, you go and you visit them, you spend an entire day, and the married couple that runs it, they play music that was written for those pianos in the era that they were manufactured. And you start to understand how, particularly in the 19th century, when there were hundreds of different piano makers all over Europe and America, every country had its own sound. And for instance, the piano makers in Vienna didn't care what audiences in New York or Paris liked. They cared what audiences in Vienna liked. And so the pianos were very different. And Chopin's favorite piano was a PAAA, which is a French brand. He also loved the Erard. He loved the Erard when he was, when he really needed to. There's a very famous quote about how he used the Erard when he, when he needed to find a ready-made tone, but when he was really feeling himself, when he really felt that he could be independent and really an artist, he needed the PAAA piano. So for him, the different sounds of these different instruments really were very important, and the piano was evolving so much during that period. The sounds were getting bigger. The technology of the piano enabled a whole different kind of musicianship to happen. So what we hear today on a modern Steinway is, of course, very different from what Chopin would have sounded like. But Chopin hated to perform in large halls, in part because people criticized his sort of small style, small sound, and so he went off really and kind of left the concert stage at a time when, not unlike our own time, where celebrity and publicity was really a major thing that was now starting to take over the culture. And there were piano duels. I mean, Franz Liszt gave, I think, 1,000 concerts in an 8-year period, and Chopin during his life gave 30. To me, one of the things that was so remarkable, and this is a theme in the book, is Chopin's independence, his his ability to walk away from the stage. I mean, if you think about today, for instance, somebody like Lang Lang just saying, I'm gonna leave the recording world. I'm not gonna play publicly. I'm gonna play in small salons. That's how extraordinary it was, I think, for Chopin to have removed himself from the public eye at a time when there were newspapers, the Industrial Revolution was just firing up. There were factories that were putting out, printing presses and sheet music and newspapers and magazines, and celebrity was a thing that was really on the rise. And he walked away from it. And I found that really, really inspiring and quite remarkable.
Absolutely. It's always good to keep in mind that not every famous pianist was cut from the same cloth, so to say. So at this point, I'm happy to call on our board member, Ted, to ask a question. Ted, the floor is yours.
Yes, about the first movement of that sonata, it is the sonata form convention that the exposition, which presents the first and second subjects, is repeated. There's some controversy about from where that repeat should go in this sonata. It starts with a slow introduction, and after several bars, there's a notation, doppio movimento, which means double the movement, twice the speed. And various pianists have argued that the repeat should be from the doppio part. Others argue that the repeat should be from the slow introduction. Yet others punt the issue by not doing the repeat at all. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, and maybe something from Alvin also in that regard.
I'd actually be interested in what Alvin has to say, because that's one of those weedy conversations that I think is best left to musicologists and professionals. And I am a real and proud and happy amateur. I've read all of these different, there's so much criticism about this sonata, so you can read about this pretty much anywhere. But Alvin, what did you do? What was your thought process when you recorded the sonata?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you're considering just this third movement, the march, because I would have to go back to the first minute and take a look at the score to be able to answer that one. I think sometimes they did that just to extrapolate more when they're doing a repeat. Sometimes you don't need it. Of course, it depends on the timing of your concert too. And because I think they made choices like that of how long a concert do I have? How much music can I put in here? Or are we just having fun? We're just going to go ahead and repeat it. So that's one concept that I know musicians think about as far as the lengthiness. But it also, in the march part, of course, he does the march and he goes to the romantic section, and that's actually repeated. Each one of those sections is repeated, and then it goes back to the finale part again. So it lends opportunity to get that much more sincere, especially in the romantic section, I think. And maybe even for the musician and the listener to go deeper with it. It expands the whole landscape that Chopin was trying to create. It almost makes me think about Schubert, because Schubert did a lot of repeating kind of things, and Chopin no doubt was very aware of that. And it just creates a larger landscape. And that's the main reason why I think repeats happen. Beethoven did the same thing to create a larger landscape and more opportunity for the listener to go there. So that's kind of in a nutshell.
And I think, it's worth mentioning that there are, mountains and mountains and mountains of scholarship about all of Chopin's work. I mean, all the great, of course. And these are things that musicologists love to argue about and unpack and kind of chew on, and I love reading about it, even though some of it I goes over my head. But the language of musicology is so often so beautiful and so evocative that it's fun sometimes just to read it, even if you don't completely understand it, because it's so remarkable.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Renata. Renata, will you ask yourself or?
Well, I just wonder, when you wrote the book, Chasing Chopin, who you think your readers will be, and will they be different from readers that you intended for the park in New York City?
Well, you know, that's a good question. I mean, it's you always sort of have a reader in mind when you write a book, but then you try to not think too much of the reader because you want to just write the book that you're supposed to write, that you feel you need to write. The Heinlein book was really, it was a very easy book to write in the sense that there was a huge amount of research, but it was clearly, it was a book for anybody who loved New York history, who liked to, I mean, I look at that landscape, for instance, and I just see layers and layers and layers. And so for people who love New York, what that book does in words, but with lots and lots of photographs, is it just unpacks all of those different parts of the city around the Heinlein Park. So it's as much about that part of and the history of New York City as it is about the Heinlein. The Chasing Chopin is a narrative, and I wrote it. You know, I'm not, as I mentioned, I'm not a professional musician. I'm not a professional biographer. I'm somebody who improbably fell in love with the Funeral March and who wanted to figure out what it was that could make that happen, and what was happening in the music. And so that it was something that just kept, you know, it just kept digging and digging and digging. I tried, and because I'm not a musicologist, there's nothing terribly complicated in this book. There's a little bit of music theory. And some people have told me, and my partner, for instance, who's not a musician, but whose father was a jazz pianist, she said, you know, there were a couple of things that you wrote about that were a little bit complicated, but I just breezed past them. And then I went on to the rest of the book. And that's exactly what I would hope any reader would do with any kind of book. Most books do have sections that are tricky. But I really intended it for just a reader interested in history and art and culture and music. It's really a book about, it's about Chopin. It's also about Georges Sand. It's about Delacroix. It's about this really extraordinary group of artists at this pivotal moment in the decade of the 1830s who were upending culture. They were breaking rules. They were bending orthodoxies. And it was a really extraordinary moment in cultural history. So it's really a book that looks at that as well. You know, it takes a piece of music as its narrative spine, but it really is also about what it meant to live in that period, that extraordinary period, and to be an artist in that period, and those conversations that happened between those artists, particularly Sand and Chopin, which I think were quite fascinating.
Thank you.
I tried to eavesdrop a little bit, you know, to let the reader eavesdrop onto those conversations, some of which we have as part of the historical record through their letters and diaries and things.
Thank you. Did she really wear pants underneath her dress?
She wore pants and not even a dress. Yeah, she did. But, you know, she did. I mean, originally she wore pants because she wanted to go to the theater and women couldn't gain entry into the theater. So the only way that she could go and see the theater in Paris was to dress like a man. So that was the original impetus for her doing that.
Okay, thank you.
So we're quickly running up against the clock here, but we have two quick final questions. Maybe we can have them posed and then give Annik the floor to answer. So we have one question from Mary and then a question from our president, Celia. So Mary, perhaps you can go first.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And I just loved your photographs and I can't wait to do the highline. But I have a question about what was the most unanticipated or surprising part of your research with regard to this book, either about Chopin's music or his life?
I think the most, I mean, there were a number of surprises, including that he eliminated the word funeral. That was a big one. Another really moving surprise for me was when I went to visit Nohant, the home of Georges Sand that was first owned by her grandmother. And I walked in there and my guide showed me the Chopin's room and what Georges Sand had done to his room. She basically channeled modern audiology, and she created this special door for him that was made of horsehair and fabric, and she removed the tiles from the floor and put wood down there because the house was very noisy. And there were children and servants and all kinds of chaos happening all the time. And Chopin was very sensitive to noise. I'm very sensitive to noise too, so this particularly resonated with me. But I found it really, it was an example of this very complicated relationship that they had, but it was based on a kind of mutual respect for each other's artistry. And Sand really thought of herself as somebody whose main duty it was to enable other artists. And so here she was soundproofing with modern techniques this space for her partner so that he could work creatively and not be disturbed. I found that really, really surprising, that she would take her enabling instincts down to the bones of her house.
Thank you.
Celia, would you like to say a word?
Okay, as I was listening to the presentation, all kinds of thoughts were going to my mind about the landscape of New York and thinking about the landscape of Paris. And this may be a topic for a longer conversation at another time because we're running out of time. However, I just want to point to it because I gave it a lot of thought over the last period of time when we are stuck at home a lot of times and we turn the music on. Music is constantly present with us. Now, when I look at your picture and there was no music and there was no sound, but when you were taking those pictures, you probably heard a lot of sound, all kinds of noises and some music coming from boom boxes, coming from the stores and everything. Now, Paris during Chopin's time had its own noise. It wasn't maybe as overpowering as ours now. And then when you think of monks writing music in their monasteries, when there was no sound from the outside. So the outside world, how do you think that influences the music of the composer as you look at it and you were presenting your pictures?
No, that's a lovely thought. I mean, it's true that photographs don't capture the the audio or the landscape, but there is what you've said reminds me that, you all, many of you may know about the concerts that I think it was the Chopin Institute put on in Jelezowa every Sunday during the summer of last year. You could stream them. They started early in New York because they started early in Poland. But before and while the pianist was playing in Chopin's home, his birth home, the camera would take a little detour and pan around to the landscape of Jelezowa. So you would see the birds flying and the water and the wind in the trees and the flowers bending. And it was as though they were saying the landscape is as one with the music. And it really, I thought that was really wonderful. And I hope they do that again this summer because it was a major part of my summer last year, every Sunday watching those. Because music and sound, music and landscape are two such married things.
Absolutely. And it always takes a few minutes to get the audience engaged. So I'm glad we have these questions coming in now. The very last question, or perhaps even a comment from Yaroslav, if you may, to keep it brief, and then we'll conclude the event. So Yaroslav, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you for letting me to say hello to everybody, and especially to the author. I was really fascinated with the book, and finally we meet online. And what I would like to say is the author is suggesting to listen to our music, and I would like to point that the Chopin did have something to the sonata that was the initial way of combining all these movements that he created as a whole sonata. And I don't know, because I was late to be in the meeting, but that sonata is of course Beethoven Sonata Opus 26, and the first part of the sonata is variation. It's not it's a theme with the variation. The second part is scherzo, like in Chopin sonata. The third part is funeral march, And Chopin took a lot of the ideas from Beethoven in this, especially the trills that Beethoven wrote it completely different.
Mhm.
And of course, even that third movement is just the 16th notes, all like in Beethoven, just the 16th notes flying all over like the wind. And this is the only sonata that's supposedly Chopin played. That's the only piece that actually Chopin played from the Beethoven repertoire, which is really remarkable. And this is the only piece of Beethoven that Chopin played during, I think, 1 or 2 at the recitals. So I would like to encourage everybody to listen to the examples that they are online of how we imitate or take from Chopin, and of course the Beethoven, especially this sonata, to see how it is incorporated, how the funeral march is incorporated in sonata, and how Chopin took example at the Beethoven to create his masterpiece. Thank you.
You for those comments. I think that's a very fitting place for us to leave off on, and to remind everyone that Annik's book not only is a treasure chest of information, but it also has an accompanying website that kind of plays with some of the topics that it explores in the book, and reminds us of really the permeance of Chopin's sonata and in different genres and aspects of modern life even. So at this stage, I just want to really once again thank Annik for joining us, for taking the time to be here with us, and also for supporting our scholarship efforts by presenting today, but also by donating a portion of book sales from Politics and Prose to our scholarship. As a former scholarship recipient myself, I know it really means a lot to young Polish American students to receive the academic support. So thank you for making that possible, and a big thank you to all of the Polish American Arts Association friends and members for supporting us as well. And I hope you all enjoyed today's event, and we'll explore the romanticism and beauty of Chopin, be it while walking on the High Line or anywhere else. So I think with that, we can conclude our event.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be with you all, and good luck with the scholarship. I'm so thrilled that you're supporting that. That's really wonderful.
Thank you so much. And we'll have, and there's more information about all of our events on our website, PAAA.us. And there's also information there how you can purchase Chasing Chopin or any more information about today's event. So please be sure to find us there, or alternatively on the PAA's Facebook page. So look for us there. But thank you so much again for everyone for joining us, and wish you all a great Sunday.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.